Order, please. We'll now move on to orders of the day with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Last week, a paramedic named Adam Hussey escorted a young man in crisis to the emergency room at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital after that young man flung himself in front of Mr. Hussey's car. When they got there, they found that every one of the mental health patient rooms was full. As Mr. Hussey says, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "This is where the system is failing him and everyone in Cape Breton." I'd like to ask the Premier, will he agree with Mr. Hussey and now admit that there is, in fact, a crisis in the delivery of mental health services in the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all know that there are times when we will have all clinicians occupied. I know in this particular case there are certainly a whole number of unknowns, and we certainly are taking a look and take each case that is presented to the department and to the emergency department at Cape Breton Regional very seriously, and this is certainly an ongoing look at this particular case.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what is known is that this young man was mentally ill. He was in crisis. He attempted to take his own life. He was basically picked up, and luckily, by Mr. Hussey, who is a paramedic, who knows this is not a rare incident. Mr. Hussey is a regular visitor to the emergency room at Cape Breton Regional. He knows this is the case far too often. In fact, he then escorted this young man to the mental health unit at the hospital, only to find that he had actually been discharged from that mental health unit just hours before, Mr. Speaker. As Mr. Hussey says, there was nowhere to put him. I hear all these people saying they're doing things. They want change, but nothing is changing. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier now agree to call a public inquiry into the state of our mental health system so that people like that young man can get the help that they need?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all members across the province who are working to support families and adolescents with mental health challenges. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the clinicians who have been providing support to this government in ensuring that we have the proper supports for families across Nova Scotia. We know there is more work to do. That's why the Minister of Health continues to work with experts dealing with adolescent mental health, but really mental health issues across the entire population. And he'll continue to do so, to listen to those experts to make sure that we put in place the proper supports to help families.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess the answer continues to be no. But despite all the evidence that people like this young man are not getting help, Mr. Speaker, that there is a crisis in the delivery of mental health, that too many Nova Scotians who are mentally ill or the families that are struggling to help them are not getting the help that they need, Mr. Speaker, there is still no solution that makes sure that they are cared for, Mr. Speaker. In the light of all that, the Minister of Health recently stated publicly that the government is considering closing some of the mental health units of the province. If we're not going to have a public inquiry before this session is over, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier to at least assure Nova Scotians that there will be no closures of the province's mental health units.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I believe what the Minister of Health said. We've said it many times in this House that we would be speaking with healthcare providers, clinicians, mental health support people across the province to ensure that the services that we're providing communities are the services that those communities require. What he said, in some cases, that the complement may change, but that we as a province and clinicians and healthcare providers will continue to provide those supports to Nova Scotia families that require them.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. After the CEO of Doctors Nova Scotia came to law amendments this week, a source close to the Premier leaked information about negotiations that Doctors Nova Scotia have since called inaccurate and misleading. Mr. Speaker, after picking fights with home care workers, with nurses and all health care workers, with film workers, with teachers, and all public sector workers, why has the Premier now started to pick fights with Nova Scotia's doctors?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The only thing inaccurate, Mr. Speaker, is what doctors in Nova Scotia are telling doctors across this province. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with doctors to ensure that they remunerate, Mr. Speaker, in the proper fashion, but we wanted to make sure that the proper facts were out there, and the 55% pay raise, Mr. Speaker, is unacceptable no matter what profession you're in, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier needs to be reminded that many of our province's doctors are aging and many of them will be retiring, and that means that our province is going to need to be able to recruit and to retain doctors over the next number of years, Mr. Speaker. And our province, in order to ensure patient care, needs to be an attractive place for doctors to practice. Mr. Speaker, given the difficulty the government has had thus far in recruiting and retaining doctors, I want to ask the Premier how he thinks picking fights with doctors will further that cause.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I also want to thank the Minister of Health and all healthcare providers across this province who have been working with the Minister to develop a healthcare delivery model that so many healthcare providers want, including doctors, Mr. Speaker, who are part of looking for innovation, looking for an opportunity. But I can tell you there's not a single doctor in this province who's asked us for a 55% pay raise. It's been doctors in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, who wouldn't communicate that to their members, Mr. Speaker. We communicated with that to make sure all the facts were on the table, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to finding a resolution to this. We're looking forward to working with doctors to ensure that Nova Scotians get the health care in communities where they deserve it.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the CEO of Doctors Nova Scotia also said something else that was really quite troubling, and that was about the fact that it was unclear what this government's vision for health care was, and that there didn't appear to be any role for doctors in where this government was taking health care. A health care system without the involvement of doctors isn't much of a health care system, Mr. Speaker. So I want to say to the Premier, how can it be that we're 2 years into the mandate of this government, 2 years into the largest reorganization of the health system in our province's history, and doctors are saying they have yet to be consulted and included in that process?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think what the honourable member is suggesting, I think what she said, it was Doctors Nova Scotia who was suggesting that, Mr. Speaker. Doctors have been included all through this process, Mr. Speaker. Doctors Nova Scotia do not, quite frankly, represent the doctors, Mr. Speaker. We're talking to this government and representing communities across this province. They want to be part, Mr. Speaker, of the solution, Mr. Speaker. They want to be part of creating innovation. They want to be part of driving change, Mr. Speaker. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, we will work with them and continue to drive change that ensures Nova Scotia families get the health care in their communities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the government has made several attempts now to bring legislation to this House governing the activities of public sector workers. Mr. Speaker, last fall it was Bill 1 with the health unions, which was later found to be unconstitutional by the government's own hired arbitrator. Mr. Speaker, that bill was drafted with the help of outside counsel. I'd like to ask the Premier who outside the government assisted in the drafting of the current bill before the House today.
There you go. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Very pleased to have been able to bring forward legislation, Mr. Speaker, that respects workers across this province, provides them with a fair compensation package, Mr. Speaker, considering the economic challenges this province is facing. We believe it's fair to workers as well as fair to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Oh, that's great, Mr. Speaker, but I asked who wrote it, and I still don't have an answer to that question. But I am interested in what's going on with the doctors of the province, Mr. Speaker, as other members on this side of the House are. There seems to be two stories, one told by Doctors Nova Scotia and one told by the government about what's going on at their negotiating table, Mr. Speaker. The doctors' representatives say the negotiations are going well. The Premier says they weren't going well. I'd like to ask the Premier if he can share with the House who the government has hired as their lead negotiator in their negotiations with doctors.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure all members of this House we have gone to the bargaining table looking for a resolution, looking for a deal. Mr. Speaker, it became very clear to us that what was being talked about at the bargaining table representing doctors in Nova Scotia was not being communicated to doctors. As we were hearing from doctors across the province, Mr. Speaker, about why they were part of this legislation, we very clearly had to lay out to them why they were part of this legislation, because doctors in Nova Scotia was not communicating to them what they were asking from the government of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. The Deaf Advocacy Association has been forced to close its office and reduce support for Nova Scotians who are deaf or hearing impaired after the funding was eliminated by the Premier in his spring budget. Mr. Speaker, I think given the events of the last 2 days, we can all agree that there is a need to have more support for Nova Scotians who are deaf or hearing impaired and who experience discrimination, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is this: why did his government eliminate the funding it provided to the Deaf Advocacy Association of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I ask the Minister of Community Services to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Hi, we appreciate all of the work that's done across the province by nonprofits. We know that difficult decisions had to be made. In this particular case, we also knew that funding had been reduced, I believe eliminated by the United Way to this particular organization. We had worked with them for many years. The outcomes and the advocacy part of it at this point in time did not align with the mandate of community services. We have worked with them, we communicated that to them, and we're going forward with working with other organizations that provide similar services.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Well, obviously, the Minister and the government didn't appreciate these services enough, Mr. Speaker, because the $34,000 the Premier and the Minister of Community Services have saved provides virtually no benefit for the provincial government, Mr. Speaker, with respect to their deficit, but it has devastated and has had a devastating impact on those who rely on this organization for support. This organization has had to close its doors, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the Premier if he and his government would restore the $34,000 that the Deaf Advocacy Association of Nova Scotia require to provide the services that they provide to people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The Minister of Community Services has said that they're partnering with other organizations to provide that service. But as to the question that was asked of me, I will look into this and have a look and see whether that decision that we made and whether who's covering that and making sure, and I will communicate that back to the Leader of the New Democratic Party.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Paris Climate Change Conference is now calling on over 190 countries around the world to further reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, Mr. Speaker. And Nova Scotians have done a lot already, but they may well be asked to do more, to do their part as part of Canada's effort in that area. Mr. Speaker, there is mounting evidence that the amount of renewable energy that we can put on the grid here is reaching its natural maximum, Mr. Speaker, but natural gas continues to provide a new way for Nova Scotians to generate electricity that would further reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I'd like to ask the Premier if he supports the idea of using more natural gas to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an affordable and clean way here in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who over the last through successive governments have worked with governments, community organizations, Mr. Speaker, to reach our target of not only 10% below the 1990 levels of GHG, but we'll actually achieve 20% by 2020. That's a positive contribution. Mr. Speaker, and I've said to the Prime Minister and other premiers, we have power rates that reflect that, as well as the modal fuel tax. We want flexibility in any chance of what's happening in terms of the national government looking at what we do to deal with climate change. And I've also said to them we have a tremendous opportunity as a country. We have huge hydroelectricity opportunities in Newfoundland and Labrador and in Manitoba. We should be making moving forward, building a hydroelectricity system that allows the transmission of hydroelectricity across this country. So not only can Canadians be provided with a stable, secure energy source, but with an opportunity to export it into a market that is starved for renewable energy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that is, of course, all very well and good, but Nova Scotians who have already done so much may well be called upon by our new national government to do more, and natural gas is a way of generating electricity that is cleaner than the way we do now, and in many cases cheaper, Mr. Speaker. So we have an obligation here to develop our natural gas resources offshore and onshore in order to do our bit for the environment and to help with the generation of electricity. Mr. Speaker, it's been well over a year. We're still waiting for the government's definition of high-volume hydraulic fracturing so we can find out whether we have an opportunity onshore beneath our feet or not. So I'd like to ask the Premier if he will now tell us when Nova Scotians will see a definition of high-volume hydraulic fracturing so we can get on with that new industry one way or another.
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Again, I want to thank all Nova Scotians for the tremendous work they've been doing in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. I'm extremely excited, Mr. Speaker, with the activity that's happening in the Bay of Fundy, with harnessing the energy of the Bay of Fundy. An opportunity for our region when it comes to hydroelectricity. We're looking at it across the nation, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with the national government to ensure that we capitalize on the renewable energy sources that we have. And of course, we would look at all possibilities to provide any kind of cleaner, greener energy sources to the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This may be the last question period of this session, so I want to make this question a good one for the Premier, and so I'm going to do that now. Mr. Speaker, the new Liberal government in Ottawa has made it clear that they intend to legalize marijuana across our country. Mr. Speaker, last week the Premier of Ontario, the Liberal Premier of Ontario, expressed her great interest in selling marijuana through the liquor stores of the province of Ontario. I'd like to take this moment to ask the Premier of Nova Scotia whether he also intends to sell marijuana through the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission retail outlets.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, sounded like a great suggestion for Ontario. So we, as a province, will look at what's happening, what proposal the national government brings out, and we'll look at how that product will be made available in this country when it becomes legal, in this province when it becomes legal at the time. And when it does, we'll do our part to ensure that we keep Nova Scotia children safe.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to accuse the Premier of blowing smoke on that answer, but in the spirit of the times, I'll avoid doing that. Mr. Speaker, the federal government's mandate letters to the Minister of Justice require her to consult with their provincial counterparts about how best to legalize the sale of marijuana and how it would be retailed. In that case, Mr. Speaker, I will ask the Premier, will he assure Nova Scotians now that they will be thoroughly consulted before his government considers how they'll allow retailing of marijuana across the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments. I do want to assure the member I didn't inhale, just in case he was asking. But let me tell you, this is one of those questions I said was one of the strangest questions I received when I ran for public office, was this whole question when Sun News was asking people whether they were smoking marijuana or not. And I said no one would believe a 50-year-old man had never smoked marijuana. Thank God they knew my mother, so they knew it wouldn't be acceptable in my house. But I also want to tell him that the Minister of Justice has spoken to a national counterpart. She has offered to sit as part of a committee if they're looking at this. So the Minister and the Department are looking at this and finding the best way to make sure. If this becomes a legal product in Canada, how do we make sure that we make it available in a safe way in this province?
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Marguerite Centre is the only facility for women recovering from addiction and abuse in Nova Scotia. The Marguerite Centre receives 50% operational funding from the Minister's Department, while the 3 men facilities in the province receive 74%, 90% and 93% operational funding. This funding disparity amounts to a total of $90,000, Mr. Speaker. The Marguerite Centre is currently at risk, a serious risk of closing if the issue of funding parity is not addressed by the Minister. Can the Minister explain why the Marguerite Centre receives such a considerably amount less in funding than similar facilities for men?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Who do you want?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This again could be, part of some of that disconnect in terms of funding, as the Department of Health has been involved, and also Community Services in terms of funding. They've had some challenges for a number of years. I believe that there is some reorganization that is going on. We've reached out to the Marguerite Centre, and in fact we're providing them with funding that will enable them to carry on their work for the remainder of this fiscal year, but more importantly, taking a look at equity across the recovery house sector, and also looking at sustainability for Marguerite House. There's no question the work they do is stellar and needed in the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, again to the Minister of Health. We know the Minister is providing $40,000 to the centre to last them until March, and he said that they'll be receiving this without providing explanation on funding parity, on the funding parity issue, Mr. Speaker. Executive Director Lisa Mullen says she believes the Department of Health is making her organization feel like they are poor managers of money, but that's the opposite. The opposite is true, Mr. Speaker. Mullen simply is looking for the Minister to address the lack of funding parity, which has threatened the recovery of its residents and the attraction and retention of the staff that is so important to that facility. Does the Minister believe it's fair that he funds the Marguerite Centre far less than other recovery homes across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't until the alarm bells in terms of the challenges they had at Marguerite Centre that the funding, inequities that exist came to my attention. I've been out to the Marguerite Centre to meet staff, to meet clients there, have a look at what is indeed taking place. They do have one very challenging arrangement with the federal correctional services, and I believe a little bit of, again, reorganization, and we as a department will work with them in the coming months to look at a strong and sustainable future.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you this morning will be to the Minister of Education. I know in recent days the Minister has made comments around the EF tours that high schools in the province are considering taking. I think that they're still on. There seems to be a bit of confusion at my local school today, or yesterday now, as to the input of the province and specifically the Minister. And I just wanted her, if she would, to clarify the position of her and her department on these tours, whether there'll be decisions made or offered.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As I spoke earlier this week, there were concerns that were raised, in fact, across many provinces, but in particular, Alberta had taken a position with regard to international travel, and in fact had said they would ban international travel in light of the safety concerns that existed in some of the destinations for that travel. Here in the province, we have contacted our school boards and asked them to
go back to these parents and the school advisory councils and the school principals to have a second look at where those students would be traveling in light of the unrest and the safety concerns that exist across the province. Any decisions about the future of international travel is certainly within the hands of the parents and the schools and is not within my purview, but it certainly is, I think, my responsibility to raise the awareness and ask them to have those conversations.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the clarification by the Minister. And I'll be attending a meeting sometime later today at Evanview High School, where I have two daughters who plan to be on a trip coming March, and was very politely told today that perhaps I should check with my friend, the Minister of Education, to clarify or to ask why it is she's shutting this trip down. But there's a lot of miscommunication around within the parent group and these children, so I do appreciate the clarity around that. And does the school board, I guess just to finish, does the school board minister have the ability to actually cancel the trip? There's a lot of gray there with EF tours. They are sort of part of the school and they're not. I'm just curious as to whether the board has the authority to cancel these trips.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's nice to know there's a friend over there. I do want to say to the member who will be going to the meeting that I think the nature of the trip is important. In fact, there are students who are doing international travel that is something that's done outside of the school, but the students are in the schools. The fundraising that's done, whether it's band trip or whatever, is certainly a great contribution from parents to raise the funds to do those trips. And I think it's important to know and to distinguish whether this is a school supported, funded trip or whether it involves students in the school. And I think there's a difference because some of them, as I said, are organized and fundraised for outside of the school. So I think that clarity would be important for the member to get at the meeting today.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. A high-level update for the capital budget was included in the overall budget update the Minister of Finance provided earlier this week. At least they tell me it was earlier this week, Mr. Speaker. It seems like a lot longer ago. The government usually provides a detailed update on the capital budget in early December. Around this time anyway, I just wonder if the Minister can update the House on when we can expect to see the details of the capital budget.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. With respect to our capital plan, many of the large-scale projects that we have in place that are a number of years out that are obviously amortized with significant investment from taxpayers already, so that is part of the 5-year capital plan. What the local staff and the staff here in Halifax, Bruce Fitz and the Chief Engineer, are working on now are the final details for the local roads, so the maintenance, paving, and the annual allotments that we have. So that's the finishing touches. We're just working on a few specifics, so it'll be early in the new year, and we'll have that full and ready to go and release to Nova Scotians. Thanks.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there is a part of the capital budget that talks about schools and what's going to happen with schools. So I'll ask maybe if, and I'm not sure if that falls under the Minister of Education's purview of the capital budget for school additions, alterations, and new schools, or maybe under the Minister of Transportation, but maybe either one of them can update the House as when we can see what the plan is for what's happening around those types of buildings and structures.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For our perspective, the Department of Transportation assumes those projects when the details and the design are pulled together. So that becomes part of the government's large-scale capital plan, the overall capital plan. So it's not specific to our 5-year road plan, but it will be part of the overall collective capital plan. And now with some of the changes inside government, they will be the function of TIR as well. So all those capital projects as they relate to infrastructure will be under our department. Thanks.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. When the session started, we heard from the Minister of Health that we would soon hear an announcement about mental health in Pictou County, and I think at one point he said we'd hear an announcement very soon before the House rises, and it was maybe going to be the next week. But we've been a little busy up here in the House. I didn't know if I missed that announcement. Maybe the Minister of Health can update us on if he's made an announcement about the mental health services in Pictou County, or if he plans to make one, because it's something that people are still very concerned about, obviously. So.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite. Yes, mental health services are always, of course, of concern to Nova Scotians, knowing that, in fact, there are adequate services. In fact, he himself, I believe, or at least one of his colleagues, talked about the fact that Nova Scotia is very well off in terms of the number of psychiatrists on a per capita basis, and that is a good news story in relation to what's happening at the Aberdeen. In fact, this afternoon at 1:30, I'll be meeting with the Nova Scotia Health Authority.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So presumably that would be an update meeting on things like staffing and stuff like that, and would the people of Pictou County expect to hear from the Minister shortly thereafter as what they can expect in changes or improvements or to services mental health in Pictou County?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we know that the whole services for Pictou County, and indeed, as we move to a provincial model of service, we know that not every community or every regional hospital can provide the full array of services. So the review has been done for that area, and we should have determination very shortly on the array of services that will be provided in that area.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month I asked the Minister of Health about the 1% budget reduction his health authority was trying to find in each department. Surprisingly, Mr. Speaker, the Minister didn't answer that question. And today we've learned that Nova Scotia Health Authority CEO Janet Knox is trying to get her budget back on target in part by not filling vacancies. I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister provide a detailed list of those vacancies?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it is timely, in fact, the meeting today of the Nova Scotia Health Authority to review a number of decisions that have been made and others that are pending. What I can say is that the Nova Scotia Health Authority have found a tremendous number of efficiencies in their first 9 months of operation. Procurement, in fact, has probably exceeded the savings from procurement has exceeded expectations. And I will ask that question about positions not filled, but as the member opposite and former health minister would know, that under his watch there were periods of time as well when there were vacant positions as we looked for the human resources that could best fill those needs.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Well, I appreciate the Minister's going to ask the question, but the question I asked him, will he provide us a detailed list? And still no answer, Mr. Speaker. I think Nova Scotians deserve to know what the new health authority is doing around vacancies. Not filling vacancies is just kicking the problem down the road, Mr. Speaker. The CEO, Janet Knox, has called on all branches to find the 1% savings. Can the Minister advise us if all branches, clinical care, cardiac care, dialysis, mental health, cancer care, have they all been asked to find the 1% savings?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to say and can confirm for the House and all Nova Scotians that the 1% savings, in fact, are targeted towards the whole administrative block right across the province. Frontline positions are being filled, and we know that that area has not been impacted by the 1% ask.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Acting Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, the softwood lumber trade agreement between Canada and the United States expired October the 12th. The 2006 agreement was reached to regulate Canadian softwood exports to the United States while ending 5 years of court battles. My question to the Minister, what timeline have you been provided with by the federal government regarding negotiations with the United States?
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Trade.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and thank you for the question. I can advise the honourable member that I have been in touch with my federal colleague who reached out shortly after being named to talk about this file. This is a file that's very important to not only Nova Scotia but to the Maritimes as well. The federal government is currently starting the process of negotiations with the federal government. It's anticipated this is going to be challenging negotiations, but we all know the importance that industry is to our province and to the Maritimes, and we'll certainly continue to advocate that exclusion that currently exists in that softwood lumber agreement for the Maritimes is maintained in any new agreements.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the softwood lumber agreement returned $4 billion in duties collected by the U.S. on Canadian producers and gave the Atlantic provinces an exemption from quotas imposed on larger producers such as British Columbia. Since the agreement was signed, Nova Scotia's exports reached $85 million last year. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. If the exemption was left out in a new softwood lumber agreement, it would be devastating to the Nova Scotia lumber industry, which is already struggling. And my question to the Minister, will the Minister seek a guarantee from the federal government that the Atlantic province's exemption will be protected?
The Honourable Acting Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to confirm with the member that is the position of our government. That is the position we've taken with the federal government. And just to clarify, we are now in a process, a holding pattern that is basically has opened the North American market up in a free trade situation. So Nova Scotia is actually competing right now with other jurisdictions in Canada because of this very fact that the agreement has expired, and so we're actually doing quite well in comparison with our other jurisdictions in this free trade agreement. But we will, of course, if there's any tariffs that are put in place, advocate that Nova Scotia does have an exclusion from that.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Natural, or the Acting Minister of Natural Resources. The license plate says Canada's Ocean Playground, and we do have a number of beautiful beaches and provincial parks, and one of which is in Pictou East. It's Melmurby Beach. It actually graced the covers of the Doers and Dreamers guides. But visitors to Melmurby Beach cannot purchase so much as a bottle of water. And I think that's a bit of a shame, but I'd just like to ask the Minister what his thoughts are on concessions at Melmurby Beach.
The Honourable Acting Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are certain parks, beach parks included, that we do allow that sort of commercial activity to take place. However, it is a policy within the department and government that for many of our beaches, the pristine, human element-free beauty of those places actually be preserved, and so there's places where we do not want to engage in that sort of commercial activity to preserve the natural beauty of those areas.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
There's long since been concessions at the beach. You could go there and have a lunch and stuff for many years, but you haven't been able to for the last few years. So people in the area want to know if that's coming back or not. I think I heard the minister say no chance, but I just want to make sure I didn't misunderstand what he was saying.
The Honourable Acting Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, I didn't say no chance. I just clarified that it is the position of our government that in certain naturally beautiful areas that we minimize the human impact on those areas, because one of the reasons why we are leading the country in protected spaces is to actually preserve that natural beauty, those natural ecosystems for the enjoyment of people.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. This month we heard testimony from the Department of Finance at Public Accounts surrounding the film industry and the film and television tax credit that was eliminated. The member from Cumberland North asked the Deputy Minister of Finance to explain what the GDP was, and then went on to ask what percentage of the GDP the film industry represented. It appeared to observers the member was implying because they are a small percent of the GDP, they are unimportant. So my question is, does the Minister of Finance feel that because the industry is small, that they are unimportant?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I think My colleague, the member for Bedford, earlier this evening clearly indicated that. Sorry? She's not an actress, exactly, Mr. Speaker, and very much takes the role of acting in the film industry very important. I think the work of the Department of Business, Nova Scotia Business Inc., with the new film fund demonstrates that, Mr. Speaker. So again, this government certainly appreciates the work of the film and television sector, the creative sector, Mr. Speaker, and the work they do. So it is an important part of our economy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At Public Accounts, the Deputy Minister of Finance was asked if the decision to cut the film and television tax credit was a good decision. He replied that it was good for Nova Scotia, but may not have been good for the industry. Does the Minister of Finance agree that while the elimination of the film and tax credit was not good for the industry, it was good for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess for the benefit of the member who wasn't in the legislature when the decision around the film tax credit, which came down with our 2015-16 budget, took place, I'd like to remind the member that at that time, Mr. Speaker, that at that time we didn't eliminate the film tax credit. We made some modifications in the budget at that time, Mr. Speaker. Subsequent to those modifications, Mr. Speaker, the film industry indicated that they didn't feel that those modifications were the best use of the funds available, Mr. Speaker. So the Department of Business worked with the industry, Mr. Speaker, came up with a new fund, which they have worked out, is in place now, Mr. Speaker, and is working for the industry and the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And back in August of this year, Mr. Speaker, a group of people on the north side, headed by Angela Hull and Sandy Keltwell-Kerr, applied to the Craft Project Play contest and were awarded the top prize of $250,000 for upgrades to a local soccer field. And Mr. Speaker, we've worked with the municipality and we're looking to ACOA for some funding. And I wrote a letter off to the Minister of Health and Wellness, and the statement came back that we do not have the infrastructure program to accommodate the crest of this size. We cannot expand on programs of fund one-off type programs. We are presently reviewing our infrastructure programs, and when that is complete, the group will be welcome to apply for the program at that time. I wonder if the Minister can update us on when this infrastructure program review will be completed, and if he'll allow me to bring back this to the people of the north side so that when this is up to date, they can reapply for some funding.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what the member is referring to is some changes within the department and getting our grant system really for all government departments in the right place. We've had organizations getting grants from as many as 4 different departments, and Nova Scotians certainly expect, that we have much more due diligence around the grant structure, and that now is getting near the end. And in the new budget year, grants, of course, will be part of the 2016-17 budget, and we expect to hear from organizations like the one referenced today.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I guess my question to the minister would be, what size of infrastructure program exists now, and what departments can we apply to see if we can get the money to help fund those projects?
The honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that the federal government, probably through its infrastructure, possibly also ACOA, they're now reviewing how they will look at capital projects for recreation. We know they're very, very important. We know they're a significant part of community development. And will there be a program that will be cost shared is one that we will have to wait and see what happens. But what I can guarantee to all members of the House and Nova Scotians is that there will be recreation grants for communities in the 2016-17 budget year.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Acting Minister of Environment. The Parks and Protected Areas Plan, released in August 2013, commits to establishing and expanding 75 wilderness areas and 129 nature reserves by 2015. A department briefing note from August of this year said that at that point only 43 wilderness areas and nature reserves from the plan had been approved by Executive Council, and I'll table that. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, specifically, how many wilderness areas and nature reserves have been approved by this government?
The Honourable Acting Minister of the Environment.
Just for clarification, Mr. Speaker, I'm not acting, Mr. Speaker. I'm sworn in as the Minister of Environment. So I guess the real, what is it? The official member of the leader of the official opposition. I am the official Minister of Environment, Mr. Speaker. What I think is important for the member opposite, she cited the number, I believe 40 or 43 that was in that August briefing note, Mr. Speaker. She's citing the number of sites, Mr. Speaker. What's important fact, Mr. Speaker, is the percentage target of at least 12% of protected area by the end of this year, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to be on track to meet that commitment. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest the Minister to study his information, because the NDP reached 12% and was going towards 13%, so it was already reached. So, Mr. Speaker, that same briefing note said that in August the percentage of protective areas in Nova Scotia was 9.9%, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, this number is well short of the provincial commitment to ensure by law that the 12% of the land in the province is protected by the end of 2015. My question for the Minister is, considering 2015 is almost over, what is the specific percentage of protected areas in the province?
The official Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member's suggestion at the beginning of her questions preamble that I get my facts straight, Mr. Speaker, but I'd like to clarify for the member opposite. In her own statement, she indicated a difference. She said that she had protected 12%, Mr. Speaker, but at the same time she cited the information in that briefing note that indicated in August there was only about 9%, Mr. Speaker. So I don't know how the NDP managed to protect 12% when in August of 2015 there was only 9%, Mr. Speaker. So I really don't understand what the member opposite is talking about.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Aberdeen Hospital in Pictou County has been without a mental health unit for several months now. Several families are anxiously waiting for the decision. The Minister mentioned earlier that there will be a meeting sometime, perhaps later today, this afternoon. The question to the Minister, has the Minister invited any staff members from the Aberdeen Hospital to this meeting?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know what has taken place in terms of reviewing the mental health unit at the Aberdeen is that staff have been involved with that process. A report is now available to start to take a look at, review the options that will be put forward, and I know that will be one of the topics in today's meeting.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several families in Pictou County that have members suffering with mental issues now feel the mental health unit will not reopen. My question to the Minister, will the Minister inform the residents of Pictou County the real reasons why the health unit may not reopen?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this stage, the report was finished, I believe, December 16th. Was the final draft of the report. A number of options are being put forth as to how mental health services will be delivered in Pictou County. I know that all those who have come with mental health issues and those in crisis and trauma amounts to 15 in 18 weeks that required short-term help at the unit, and all of those, in fact, got treatment and are back in the community.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the real official Minister of Transportation. There are around 5,000 Nova Scotians who work in road building, according to the department. A $2 million paving contract generates around 60 direct jobs, and I can table that. The 5-year highway improvement plan gives companies better opportunities to prepare for the next year's highway improvement project. Mr. Speaker, my question, can we expect to see this year's edition of a 5-year paving plan while the House is in session?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for the members' information, we've been rolling out tenders to the road builders since October. We're the first government in the history of this province to have tenders out in October, Mr. Speaker, and that's why they love us. Thank you very much.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. Just before we move on to government business, the honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my colleagues' attention to the far end of the East Gallery. I'd like to introduce the front staff and friends, front staff of the Hilton Hotel, which is certainly, for me, has become to be known as my second home. The staff is always friendly. They always have a warm cookie and a big smile when I arrive. And I just want to introduce Brendan Kane-Jones, Dominique Joseph, Elizabeth Chapman, and Stephen Chu. Please stand up. And I just want to add that Dominique Joseph is interested in pursuing a career in international politics. So good luck with that.